Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. Happy Tuesday. I hope your week is going well. We are a full week into December already. That is crazy. Somebody said yesterday that Christmas was, 19 days away, and I was like, no, it's not. And then I did the math, and I said, oh, yeah, never mind. I don't know why. I mean, I know we're a week into December. I don't know where my brain was. Speaking of Christmas, though, I mentioned on the last episode that my husband decided it was time to decorate for Christmas and go a little crazy. We haven't done a lot of decorating the last few years. And so, yeah, we put up a lot of outside lights over the weekend. Not crazy like National Lampoon crazy or anything like that, but we did a decent job on the outside of the house. And then we have 5 Christmas trees, which is fewer than we used to have, but that's another story. 4 of those Christmas trees are fully decorated. The 5th one is maybe a third of the way done. I have all the lights on and part of the ornaments, but I finished the 4th one today, and the other ones have been decorated for a couple of days. So yeah, kind of crazy, kind of fun. I have one that is, I was going to do it as a small tree, one of my 4-foot trees, and I went a little crazy last year during the pandemic making gnomes that I saw on TikTok, and I don't have any idea how many I made, because I made a bunch for the tree, and then I made a bunch for family, and I just, like I said, I went gnome crazy, and I was going to put them on a 4-foot tree, and then my husband was like, no, put them with our Rudolph plush toys, because he has all of the stuffed animal ornament toys from Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, like Herbie the Elf and Rudolph and Clarice and Santa that I absolutely hate. That Santa is a jerk, isn't he? But all of those, then some of the some of the toys from the Island of Misfit Toys, and we have them in plush. They're about, 6 inches high maybe. So I put those together with our gnome tree. It's very random, but it actually works really well. And so that is one of our trees in part of our house. So just a little glimpse into the strangeness that is our Christmas. Why even bother if you can't be a little random, right? Let's talk about books. I am speaking today with a return author. Dr. Paul Semendinger was on the podcast back in February 16th of 2021 this year. He was on episode 278 if you want to listen to that interview as well. He was on then to talk about his debut novel, Scattering the Ashes. He is on today to talk about his new nonfiction book. It is called The Least Among Them: 29 Players, Their Brief Moments in the Big Leagues, and a Unique History of the New York Yankees. The description is as follows. The Least Among Them is a most special baseball book that looks at the New York Yankees' history in an original, unique, and never-before-written manner. Throughout their history, the New York Yankees have been defined by the legends and the successes of their most famous players. But as part of their long history, the Yankees have also fielded players that have become lost to history. In this book, their stories are told. And like the subtitle says, 29 players. So there are 29 stories, but there are also what he labels the chapters as between the innings. And then you get stories extra innings. And then you get stories that are related to the stories about the least among them, but maybe feature players that you might be more familiar with. What I like about this book is you can pick it up and just sit down and read a few pages, and you'll learn something about one of those players, whether it's in the extra innings or one of the least among them. The chapters are only a few pages long each, and so you can take it in little little segments. You could sit down and read the whole thing if you want. This is the kind of sports book that I like. I'm not a huge sports fan, as you know. I have learned a lot more about sports since meeting my husband 11 years ago. I've watched more ESPN in those 11 years than I have in the entirety of my life, and more minutes of sports than in the entirety of my life. But, it's not my first love, but put anything in a book and I'll take a look at it. But I like that this is focused on more of the personal aspects. So you get stories of the people behind those. They played one game in the major leagues. One game. That's it. How crazy is that? And I like to learn a little bit more about the people behind that one game. So for me, it's always the personal history, and that's what drew me to these stories. But if you're a fan of baseball, and if you're a fan of the Yankees in particular, then you would definitely want to check out this book. Let's go ahead and have Paul talk more about the book, why he wrote it, how he chose the players and the extra innings stories, etc. So again, the book is called The Least Among Them, and the author is Paul Russell Semendinger. Hi, Paul. Welcome back to the podcast.
Sarah, it is so great to be with you again. I enjoyed myself the first time, and I'm looking forward to talking with you.
Same with me. I loved having you on the last time, and we are here to talk about your new book, which is very different from your first book. Before we get to the book, though, if you could share a bit about yourself for a refresher for those who heard the first interview, and to introduce yourself to those who hadn't heard the first interview.
Wonderful. So thank you. My name is Paul Semendinger. I'm an author, but I'm not just an author. I'm an elementary school principal. I'm in my early 50s, and so I've been a principal for a long time and an educator for a long time. I have what I think is the greatest little school in the whole wide world. It's a K-5 school with great teachers and great kids and a great community of parents and colleagues, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful place to be. So in addition to doing that, I just ran the New York Marathon a couple of weeks ago, and I still play baseball, even though I'm getting to be an old man. I pitch, and I'm a dad of 3 and a happy husband of 30 years. So it's great.
It sounds pretty great. I actually thought of you a couple of weeks ago. You posted that you'd run the marathon, and one of my publicist friends lives in New York now. She just moved in the last year, and her apartment is like a block from the route. So she went down to cheer everybody on. So there was that little bit of 6 degrees of separation with 2 people I know in very close proximity to each other.
Exactly. She probably cheered me. That's one of the joys of running the New York City Marathon is the fact that the crowd support is just so amazing. So when you get tired, you'd think it would be more exhausting to engage with the crowd around you. But if you start throwing your arms in the air, or, putting your hand up like, help me out, or this is great, they cheer and they carry you for miles just through their enthusiasm. That's wonderful. We should find out how to set that up for other things in life.
Yes,
indeed.
You're feeling a little tired. And then the other thing that, you mentioned your school, and we talked about your pupils the last time you were on. And I love some of the stories that you have, but they call you Dr. Sem, right?
Yeah, they do. They call me Dr. Sem. Yes.
That's very cute. Probably it's harder to say for a kindergartner.
Yeah, Semendinger's a hard name.
Yeah. So the book we are talking about today is called The Least Among Them. It's nonfiction. Can you share the premise of this one?
Sure. The Least Among Them is the story of the 29 Yankees, Major League Baseball players, who had the very shortest career of among anybody who ever played for the Yankees. Most people know the Yankees, and they know that they're the team that's won the most World Series, and they've had the most famous players like Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and Joe DiMaggio and Yogi Berra and Mickey Mantle and Derek Jeter. So they remember those guys. But there were 29 players who appeared for the Yankees and played in only one game, and that ended up being their entire Major League Baseball career. And so I call those 29 guys the least among them. And their story's never been told. So I told the story of each of those 29 players.
And what made you, aware that there were multiple, almost 30 players who only played in one game, and then make you want to write this book?
So I like to write about everything. So I just like to write. So that part of it made me want to write the book. Once I figured that out, that there were these 29 guys, I said, oh, I need to write a book about that. How did I find them? I spend a lot of time. I have a Yankees blog. It's called Start Spreading the News. And we publish articles 3 or 4, or sometimes even more every single day. I have a staff of writers. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about the Yankees, writing about the Yankees, writing about the current team, researching their history. And one day I was just making a list of players who played for the Yankees. And all of a sudden I realized, that guy only played 1 game and he never played for any other team. And then I said, wouldn't it be fun to write or to find out how many of these guys there are and to write their story?
That's fascinating. I mean, I know it happens, but just the fact that you finally make it to the big leagues and you play 1 game. I mean,
there's a lot of reasons why it happened. Every one of those 29 players has a different story and a different reason why. But for most of them, it's at least similar. They had a chance. They appeared in a game. Most of them didn't do very well. And then they were either sent to the minor leagues, or the season ended, or, they got hurt. And, one thing led to the next, and they just never got that chance to play again. I'll say this again, I'm 53. I still play baseball. I pitch in 2 different leagues. And if the Yankees want to call me up to just have me play 1 game, I'd happily be the 30th guy without any regrets. I'll play 1 game and that would satisfy me.
You'll be fine with that. I completely understand. What I find fascinating is that even though they only played in 1 game with the Yankees or in the big leagues, the major leagues, there's some really interesting little tidbits about these people, like the guy who got shot. I mean, not in his major league game, but still the man was playing baseball and got shot.
There was the story that was in the chapter on what I did. Let me try to be clearer. Is I didn't think that the stories of the 29 players on their own stood up, right? Again, the stories are great stories and they're interesting, and each person's their own character. But for the casual fan to hear about those games and those players, they might want a little more. So what I did was I tried to find something about each of those players that tied into a bigger story that people might know about, or that I did my own research and uncovered. And basically, Babe Ruth in 1932 is famous for hitting a home run, supposedly, that he called. It's the Babe's called shot. He supposedly pointed out to center field at Wrigley Field in Chicago. And then the pitcher, Charlie Root, threw the ball and the Babe hit the next ball right where he was pointing. And some of the background about that, yes, happened around a baseball player who was shot, which was also an inspiration for Bernard Malamud when he wrote his novel, which became a great movie with Robert Redford, The Natural.
Now that you know a little bit more about the book, The Least Among Them, we are going to go ahead and take our first break of the podcast. When we come back, Paul and I will be talking a little bit more about those extra innings chapters and how he chose who went into those chapters, what stories he wanted to tell, etc. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts bring you the Bible Study Podcast. Reflect and journey the Bible as together we study God's Word and be inspired. Bible study made fun and informative for all ages. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Bible Study Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with author Paul Russell Semendinger about his nonfiction book, The Least Among Them, 29 Players, Their Brief Moments in the Big Leagues, and a Unique History of the New York Yankees. Let's go ahead and return to that interview. And yeah, actually, you segued much nicer than I did, because I just was sort of caught up on the fact that the guy got shot. But there's the 29 players, and then you have the extra innings chapters. So you get these 29 players, but then you also get interesting tidbits about players that maybe, like, even I've heard of Tommy Johns and I really don't know anything about baseball. Or I've at least heard of his surgery. Let me put it that way.
Yes.
What kinds of, I mean, you had to have done a ton of research. So where did you even start for research on some of these players?
All right. So the research, that's a great question, really was accomplished in 3 different ways. There's a wonderful website that's called baseballreference.com. And hardcore baseball fans, but even regular fans, anyone who wants to learn about the game, if you go to baseballreference.com, they have myriads, a plethora of information about every team, every player, and you can get into that information at the most minute level and find out the box scores of the games that the guys played in, who else was in the game, if they other players who were on the teams with them, where they played when they were in the major leagues. The minor league information is less complete, but who they played with when they were in the minor leagues, where they played, what their statistics were. I mean, you could just drill down what players were similar to them, who had similar careers, who played similar positions, how many awards they won. I mean, it could go on and on. And so Baseball Reference was a great beginning spot. Then what I did, once I had at least the background information for each of the players, I thought about what I was going to do for the extra innings part and wanted to be able to tell those stories real well. So then I just did regular old research, right? I got books out of the library. I have my own personal baseball library of 1 million books, and it's not 1 million, but lots and lots of baseball books. And I went back into the things that I've read and did my own research, talked to my father, who's a big baseball fan. He filled in some gaps. But then the next step was I went to the Baseball Hall of Fame, and there's a library there, and they have files on every single person who's ever played Major League Baseball. So if you call ahead and you tell them you're a writer and that you're working on something, they'll even pull the information ahead of time. So when you get there, it's already waiting for you. So I made an appointment and I got there. They had the files for each of those 29 players already pulled. And then that was my further research. I was able to then see what the Baseball Hall of Fame had on each of them. Now, interesting, some of the players, when I opened their files, they were empty. They had nothing. And one of the guys, they had the misinformation, had a little card in there that said he had played for the Seattle Mariners, but he didn't. He played for the Yankees, and I corrected their information. The next thing I did was, there's another wonderful website that you need to subscribe to, but it's called newspapers.com, and you can get a lot of original newspapers. And for some of the players who played around the turn of last century in the early 1900s, the only way to get more information was to really try to dig deep into newspapers at the time. And so I did that. And then I went back to the Hall of Fame a second time, double checked my research. And that was really the research process.
Which is fascinating. I mean, just the fact that they have a file, whether it has anything in it or not, but a file on every player who has ever played. That's got to be a ton of information to collate.
It must be. It's phenomenal. The people there, Cassidy Lent is the research librarian who I worked with. She is just phenomenal, kind, wonderful. They loved the fact that I found a mistake and they were able to correct it. And my next step, Cooperstown's probably about 4 hours from where I live in New Jersey. And my next step is to go back there and donate all my research and put it into each of the files so that each of those people's files is obviously made more extensive.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, I love that. You even include, I think it's 3 players maybe who, I could be wrong on that number.
It was 2. Yep, it was 2.
Players who played for the Yankees before they were the Yankees.
Oh, a number of those guys. Yes, the Yankees became known as the Yankees in 1913 was when they actually officially became the Yankees. They became a team in 1903. And in those first years, they were known mostly as the New York Highlanders because they played in Manhattan up on the high ground, way north in Manhattan. And then eventually they moved to the Bronx and they became the Yankees. After leaving the Highlanders, though, after they left Hilltop Park, they played for a number of years at the Polo Grounds, which is where the Giants played. They both played there. But once the Yankees acquired Babe Ruth and Babe Ruth became such a big hit, the Yankees started outdrawing the Giants at the Polo Grounds. And the Giants said, we don't want you here anymore. And so they basically said, you can't play here. And the Yankees then had to build their own stadium. And that's what they built, Yankee Stadium in the Bronx.
I find it fascinating because in a lot of ways, baseball hasn't changed, but I'm sure in a lot of ways it really has, because when you think of baseball now and then you think of baseball over 100 years ago, it had to have been different. I mean, the stories of people, whether apocryphal or not, coming out of any given day job to the big leagues, it's pretty interesting.
Yes. And I think that happened a lot more early on with some of these guys, and the season was just about over, or a guy got hurt late in the season and the leagues were taken less seriously. I think it was still very serious, but it wasn't like it is today. And they're like, hey, we need some guy. All right. I know this guy. He played in Buffalo last year, or whatever. I got his number. We can get him down here and he can play for us tomorrow. All right. And that's how it happened with some of them.
Okay, so here's what you do. You get a time machine and you go back to when this was possible, and then they can call you up and you'll get your one game.
I wish. Yes, yes.
I'm sure there's other things you could use a time machine for, but that's a possibility.
No, I think if we could get me into a Major League Baseball game, some people might go back in time and play the stock market and become a millionaire or a billionaire or something, or invest in Apple before it became big, or I don't know, march with George Washington in the Revolutionary War. I think I'd be very content going back in time and playing for the Yankees.
Yeah, sounds good. Do you have a favorite story out of this compilation of stories?
You think I might, but it's like anything else. I have 3 sons and they're all great. Everybody's great in their own way. I don't. I was just fascinated by the stories of each of them and the way that they each had their opportunity. Some of the players, I wasn't able to find out much of what happened after their careers, but some of them, obviously, they did other things, served in the wars. Some became doctors, and they just had great lives. And some never really talked about, just like in other things, they never really talked about their one game, and other people wore that as their badge forever. For one moment, I was a Yankee.
Do you think you would ever write another book like this? I mean, I know that the Yankees are your true love, but would you ever write this for another team?
I've thought about that. And I actually did look into having the title, The Least Among Them, copyrighted or that I could own it somehow. But I found out that you really can't do that. You really can't copyright a title or a concept. And yeah, I don't think I could do it, because those connections that I made to other things in Yankees history, I live and breathe in much regard, a lot of Yankees history. And I've been doing that for 40 some odd years, ever since I became a Yankees fan as a kid. I could do the research and figure out the players who were the least among them, Boston Red Sox or Los Angeles and Brooklyn Dodgers or things like that. But I don't think I have the background knowledge well enough to be able to then extrapolate other interesting Red Sox stories that are outside of what a typical baseball fan would know. So I think you'd need a really good Red Sox fan to write The Least Among Them Red Sox, or if they wanted to move it to a different sport. I don't know how many people only played for the New York Football Giants for one game. But again, I think you'd need to really be an expert on that team in order to pull it off and have a good product.
Mm-hmm. It would be maybe a little less of a passion project.
Yes. And I have so many other things that I want to write about that the last thing I want to do is get bogged down in a writing project that I don't like.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of things that you want to write about, and your debut novel was in fact a novel. It was fiction. What made you turn from writing a novel to then writing this nonfiction book?
All right, that's actually somewhat of a circuitous story. When I wrote my novel, and I think we talked about this, Scattering the Ashes was something that was just in me, and I needed to write it and get it out. And I wrote it, and it was a very long process between writing it and finding a publisher and actually having it published and available for people. And so I wrote it, but then, as I say, I like to write lots of things, and I've written other things that are nonfiction, and I've written other fiction as well. None of it published yet. None of it even ready for publication. None of it's even been rejected. But as I was going through the process of trying to find a publisher or a literary agent for Scattering the Ashes, I was still writing other things. And one of the things that I hit upon was this. So even though this was published after Scattering the Ashes was actually written before it. And one of my hopes actually with this book, and I have some children's books that are now, they're basically self-published, but they were published by a very small publisher a long number of years ago, maybe 8. Could it be that long already? About a crazy principal named Principal Sam. My hope with all of those other projects really was that they would be published, and then I could then approach the publisher, or they'd be popular enough that I could say, hey, I was the author of The Least Among Them. Will you now publish my novel? These were all originally going to be ways to try to get the novel written or published.
You write for a variety of reasons and in a variety of styles. Do you have a particular style that you're drawn to more than others, or do you just like to write in whatever genre, whether that's fiction or nonfiction, that strikes you on that given day?
Or even at that given moment. The other thing that I do is I write inspirational things. And I have another book called Impossible is an Illusion, which is just a collection of, and I think we talked about this last time, but they're just motivational passages that originate either on my other blog, that's not my Yankee blog, or most of them are things that I write for the teachers in my school. Every Friday, I put out a memo, which is very not originally called the Weekly Memo, but it begins with a reflective piece that could be a page, or it could be 2 pages, or sometimes it's 4 pages if I'm really motivated that week, or I have something I really need to delve into. And over time, a colleague, one of the teachers in my school, said, you have to get this published. And so every week I write inspirational pieces for my teachers. Sometimes some of those end up on my blog, or I write other pieces that just go straight to the blog. I write about the Yankees every day for my Yankee blog. And I try to make the time also to work on the fictional things that I'm writing. If you're asking what I enjoy the most, I don't know if I could actually say, but I think the idea of writing fiction, I don't want to say it's easier, because it's not, but when I have a fictional story in my head that I would like to tell, again, this just sort of sounds weird, but once I sit down and start writing, it just sort of writes itself.
Time for the second break of the podcast. When we come back, Paul will be talking a little bit about what he is working on now. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Paul Russell Semendinger. I don't quite know what I did with my editing. I did something silly, but I cut off the question. But basically the question was, what are you working on now? So we're just going to pick up with Paul's answer.
So what I'm working on now is a novel. I began it last year. It's called Collision, and I'm not really ready to go much more beyond that, but it's a spiritual story. I do like to write things that are spiritual, and Scattering the Ashes is a spiritual story, but not really told in a spiritual way. And this is another story like that. One of the differences between these two stories is I think in Scattering the Ashes, the main character is very likable. And in this other story, Collision, I don't think the main character is all that likable throughout much of the story. And even maybe right up until the end, I think he has maybe likable moments. But in a sense, it's also a story of redemption, but a story of redemption in a different way.
I know you don't want to say much about Collision that you're working on now, and that's understandable. I just will ask one question. Does it have any baseball in it?
I don't think I can write a story without any baseball in it, but there's if there is, it'll be very small. But there has to be a point in time when baseball happens. In my doctoral dissertation, I referenced Joe Torre, the former Yankees manager, because I had to have something in there about baseball.
I kind of thought that maybe that was the case. Do you have a hope for what readers might take away from the books that you write?
I want people to be happy when they read what I write. I want them to enjoy what I write. I think the story of The Least Among Them, even though it's nonfiction, I think the idea is there's this message in there that we can achieve our life dreams, even if only for a day. I think we can do all sort of things that are bigger than us. And The Least Among Them and Scattering the Ashes and Collision and all of these, everything I write, inspirational stuff, whether it be spiritual or not, I think there is a general message of be kind, love each other, work to be a good person, be the best person you can be. I mean, God isn't far from my thoughts at any time. And I think even if I'm not writing necessarily about God or about religion, I think some of the general themes about goodness and kindness and love and respect those ideas are always present.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's lovely. Has your writing process changed at all through the years as you've continued to write?
That's a great question. In the beginning, there were no computers. I'm not that old, but I didn't write on computer. I actually wrote by hand. And then I would then take what I wrote by hand and type it onto a typewriter or type it into a computer. And I don't do that any longer. I sit in front of the computer and I just type it out.
I'm the same way. In college, even though I had a computer, I still, for most of college, had to write everything by hand and then type it. And so like the typing would be my second draft because I could make edits. But there was something about that blinking cursor that threw me off for a long time.
Yes. And they don't blink anymore. Now it's just an arrow, right? But back then, that little blinking thing, yes.
It would sit there and mock me.
Yes. In fact, even like for teacher observations, when I observed teachers, I used to write out what I saw by hand and then type it in. And I just find that's doing double work the way my brain works. I'm doing it. And instead of just getting the process done, it was now I have the process done and now I have to type it in. And it just seemed like I was doing double work. And, you know, I revise and edit as I write. I do that every day with my Yankees work. And so I write something and I go back and I look at it and I change the words. But I find it, simple and easy to do on a computer. So that's really my process.
And I would much prefer handwriting over typewriting anyway. I mean, on an actual typewriter. In college, I actually would help people type their papers. Kids hated typing. I don't know how to type like the right way with ASDF, JKL semicolon, like using all 8 fingers and 2 thumbs. I'm really just like a hunt and pecker, but
I'm so quick that typing goes fast for me. So in college, there were kids. This was at the very dawn of the computer age, and a lot of our college stuff we just did on a regular old typewriter. And so I would make some money. I think I charged $1.50 a page to type somebody's work to make a little extra money, and they wouldn't have to type it. But I don't do stuff like that anymore.
you wouldn't make any money. No one would hire you.
That's true.
When you take time to read, what have you been reading lately?
Oh, and I love to read. I actually have a somewhat eclectic collection of what I like to read. Obviously, I read a lot about baseball. I read a lot about history. I enjoy fiction, but I don't read as much fiction as you'd think for someone who writes fiction. But I thought you were going to ask me about like what are some great things I've read lately, and I just wrote a couple of titles down. This is kind of crazy, but I've always loved the Charlie Brown comic Peanuts, Charles Schulz. And so there is a collection I think it's called The Complete Peanuts, and they have every single comic that he ever published. And I'm up to volume 6, which is 1961 to 1962. So I'm reading through it. Yeah, it's sort of like a big task, but it's so fun. Charlie Brown and Snoopy and Lucy and Linus and all them. So that's fun. There's a great baseball writer named Joe Posnanski who just published a book. It came out in October called The Baseball 100, which he says is longer than Moby Dick. And last summer I read Moby Dick, and it is longer than Moby Dick, but it's much better and it's much more engaging. Moby Dick was great. The Baseball 100 is even better. He writes the stories of 100 different baseball players who he considers the greatest 100 of all time. The last piece of fiction that I really enjoyed was a book that's probably about 10 or 12 years old. I finally got around to reading it, The Life of Pi, about the boy on the raft with the tiger. I thought that was phenomenal. Malcolm Gladwell just wrote a book probably last summer, and it's called The Bomber Mafia. And I love the way he just finds different ways to look into things that happened. And it's about World War II and aerial bombing and things like that. But that's not really what it's about. It's about the way people think and about how big ideas get moved forward. It's just phenomenal. And Jerry Seinfeld put out a book, again, probably last spring, called Is This Anything? And it's just a collection of his funniest stuff that he's already performed or just ideas that he had written down. And I read that, and I probably read that whole thing in a day and a half, just laughing the whole time. So that's some of the recent stuff that I've really enjoyed.
You are eclectic. I like it.
Yes, thank you.
This might be, I don't know, random or maybe not, but do you notice what your elementary kids are reading nowadays? I'm always fascinated to know what kids are reading.
Yes, and we do a great program. We did not invent it. So sometimes I think, like, if I say something like that, they're like, this guy's saying they did this program. We've been doing that in our school for 100 years. So we didn't invent it, but it's called One Book, One School. And we buy a copy of a book that everybody in the entire school reads, and we read it over a period of time. We have basically assigned chapters. It's sort of like a reading group, but for 400 kids and 50 adults and their families. And the idea is they read it at home, and we all celebrate in reading a book. And the book we're going to read this year is called The Wild Robot. And it's a fascinating book about a robot that ends up stranded on a deserted island with only animals, and how that robot, the animals obviously can talk, and you can see and read what the robot's thinking, but the interactions between the animals and the robots on this deserted island, it's quite a fun little book.
I love that. How do you choose a book that works for, you said K through 5 in your school, right?
Yes, it's not easy. Because usually the books that the younger kids like might not necessarily be the books that the older kids like. And you really have to figure out how to bridge that gap. And I'm very lucky because we have a great librarian, and it was her who chose the book this year. Last year, she was on maternity leave, and I had to pick the book. And, I asked the teachers too, but we couldn't quite come up with one. So I just said, I'm going to figure this all out. We've done some standards like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and things like that. But the author Avi wrote a great book that just captured me called The Secret School. And it was a story of these young kids who were going to the school out in the West, probably in the early 1900s, and their teacher was called away. And one of the students then decides to be the teacher for the other kids. And they would secretly go to the school, even though the teacher wasn't there. And this young girl who wanted to grow up and be a teacher would be the teacher. It's a fascinating story. And I thought it related very well to what we were going through, where kids were sort of teaching themselves in a sense because school was remote. And they had to figure out how to do things that they weren't going to school at least all day, every day, in some similar ways as that book. So that was our book last year. And I think it went real well. I think the book this year will go real well, but I'm always happy when the librarian picks the book and it's not something that I have to, because then I feel like I hope everybody enjoys the book since I picked it. Yeah. I think they did, but it's much less pressure when somebody else is the one picking the book.
Absolutely. I would totally feel that pressure. I love that in this time that we've been talking, you have had amazingly kind and wonderful things to say about two different librarians. And as the daughter of a librarian, I say yay.
Yes. Listen, great people are great people and they deserve to be recognized. And absolutely.
Yeah. And I think they do a lot of work that nobody ever sees. So
that's correct. As do teachers.
Exactly.
The work that teachers do behind the scenes that nobody knows about. And, they just do it because they care and they're wonderful people. And it's really what makes the difference in a school, which makes a school a wonderful place. And I'm fortunate that every single teacher in my school is that type of person. They'll do anything for kids and they'll do anything to deliver fantastic lessons that engage kids and make learning fun and interesting.
And I am so, so impressed by teachers over the last year and a half, almost 2 years now. Just they have had to pivot and just change on a dime for the way they teach. So I'm so impressed.
Me too.
Time for our last break of the podcast, but seriously, librarians and teachers, some of my favorite people. And I have a lot of friends who are teachers, and to watch them, basically over social media the last year, but to see them have to just adjust and readjust and do the best they can for their students has been very inspirational. And my hat goes off to all the teachers, even when we're not in a pandemic, but especially the last couple of years. So it's time for that last break. When we come back, Paul will be giving his internet accessibility details. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the backdoors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Paul Russell Semendinger. In terms of internet presence, website and any social media where people might be able to find you.
All right. So I have the Yankees blog. It's called startspreadingthenews.blog. That's where you can find daily articles, mostly about the Yankees. About 15 different people write with me on that blog. It's my blog, but they help me make sure I get the content there. One of the people who writes there is also my son, Ethan, who's hopefully going to be a physical therapist in a number of years. He's also a big Yankees fan. So it's sort of our project together. I have a personal blog that's at drpaulsem.com. And that's where I post some baseball stuff, but I also put about things about my writing there, running, working in a school. Some of the more spiritual stuff that I write ends up over there. And those are my two main avenues for reaching the public through my writing. I'm on Twitter, and my Twitter handle is at Dr. Paul R. Sem, DRPAUL R. Sem.
Thank you for that. And you mentioned your son, Ethan, and it reminded me that he is in your author photo with you for The Least Among Them.
Yes, yes, he is.
Which is awesome. And then that also led me to remember that you included in the copy that you sent me a baseball card of you. So that's awesome. was that for the book, or was that for something else?
No, that was for the book. When the first batch of books came to me from my publisher, who's phenomenal, there was another little box in it there inside with the books, and it said, "Open this." And I opened it up, and he had all these baseball cards made of me, which is really an author card, but it's a picture of me pitching in a baseball game. And oftentimes the catcher on my team is my son, Ethan. But he had these baseball cards of me made as my business cards for when I do book talks and I promote the book. So I just thought that was so great. And so, so when people buy the book from me, or they ask for copies or whatever, I go to a book thing, I give them a signed baseball card. It's the closest I can get to being a real baseball player.
What a fun surprise.
Yes, it was great.
Yeah. Well, Paul, we've talked about the book and we've talked about a variety of different topics, but is there anything that we haven't covered during our time together that you would like to highlight?
Oh, I just enjoyed talking with you, Sarah. It's fun. We get to talk about books and writing and reading, and then somehow that extrapolates itself into all sorts of other great ancillary topics and things. I think we've covered most of it. I hope people take the time to go find The Least Among Them. I'll tell you this. Somebody who's a fellow author, I'll tell you two things. You get me started. My brain starts moving. There were so many authors, big time authors, little time authors, people who've been published once, twice, or a million times, who I reached out to, and I have reached out to in my publishing journey and my writing journey. And by and large, every single one of them has been nothing but kind, supportive. When I was doing drafts of The Least Among Them, and I reached out to some authors who I had, casual relationships with, like we might have sent an email to each other once, or I might have sent them an email and said, "I like your book," and they wrote back, "Thanks." I figured that was like a casual relationship. It wasn't like I was friendly or friends with these people, but they were nice enough to respond. And I just said, like, "Would you like to read my book? Or would you like to read my manuscript?" They all said yes. I just was amazed. And some of them read the whole thing and then sent me information back, said, "You have a mistake on page 74. I want you to correct it." Or, "There's some things in the introduction that aren't good," or, "Don't put commas around this," or, "Don't put hyphens in the word Hall of Fame." Like, the writing community is made up of great, great, great people who are supportive and helpful and kind. And I will say that many of them are now friends. We still talk and we communicate, and I now, help them as they have books that are coming out, and they've helped me. And it's just a wonderful, tight-knit community of people. And I don't think everybody realizes that, how nice all these people are, and how helpful you might think, like, "Oh, this guy's going to write a book and that'll take people away from buying my book." But they don't think that way. They think, "Hey, you're doing something great. Let me help you." So that was nice. Which the other part of that story was, one author on Black Friday was in a Barnes and Noble up in Massachusetts somewhere. And he saw my book on the shelf in Barnes and Noble in the sports section. And he took a picture of it and he sent me and he said, "Look, you're in Barnes and Noble." And I just thought that was the coolest thing ever.
Yeah, books in the wild. I love that.
Yes.
And I even love, I get a little bit of a, ooh, when I find books from authors that I've interviewed, if I'm out somewhere, I'm like, hey, I know that person, sort of.
It's sort of right. And my one son, I have three, and they're all great. So I regret that I haven't talked much about Ryan and Alex, because they're just as wonderful as Ethan, except that Ethan's the Yankee fan and the baseball player. So he factors more in some of these discussions. But I was with Brian and Alex, and it was over, as I say, it was on Black Friday, and we were doing some geocaching, and the email came, and I saw it, and I said, guys, look at this. And Alex told me that one of the things that some of the authors that he follows do is when they have their books in Barnes and Noble or whatever, if they go somewhere and they see their book in a bookstore, they then go up to their book and they talk to the owner first, and they say, by the way, that's me. Would you mind if I autographed it and just put it back on the shelf? And they, by and large, they always say yes. So he gave me a new hobby. I haven't done it yet, but I'm going to be starting to go into bookstores. And when I find my book, I'm going to sign it. And so people buying the book won't just get the book, they'll get a signed copy.
Yeah, I've heard that from other authors. I think it's so fun.
I never heard of it before, and I think it's great. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, you get to go find your book out in the world, and then you get to sign it for somebody as a nice surprise.
Yes. So I can't wait to do that. That might be my new career. I might just try to every bookstore there is from coast to coast and back again. Who knows?
Well, it could lead to a lot of fun traveling.
And maybe I'll write a book like Travels with Charlie by John Steinbeck, right?
There you go.
Travels with Paul. He drives. I don't know how exciting it would be. I was at a bookstore today. They had my book and I signed it.
Right.
January 5th. I went to a bookstore. They didn't have my book. So I left.
You could make it. You could expand those entries into something more. I have confidence.
Maybe. Thank you.
Confidence. Well, Paul, thank you so much for joining me again, coming back to the podcast to talk not just about books, but all kinds of things. I really enjoy when you join me on the podcast.
Sarah, I love these. It's so great that we could get together again. And I wish you all the best always. And hopefully we can talk again. I'd love to come back.
Absolutely.
Thank you once again to Paul for joining me. As I said, I do truly enjoy when he comes on the podcast. Really one of the kindest people I have ever, well, not exactly met, but spoken with. Just such a very kind and wonderful man, and a great author. So if you are interested in baseball, you should definitely check out The Least Among Them, especially if you're a Yankees fan. If maybe baseball isn't your thing, then Scattering the Ashes is a great novel and talks about relationships and father-son dynamics. There's a lot to that book. You should go listen to the first interview if you are interested in that book. And again, that is episode 278 if you want to check out that interview. Speaking of interviews, I hope that you will join me on the next episode when I will be speaking with author Lori McMullen about her book, Among the Beautiful Beasts. This is the untold story of the early life of Marjory Stoneman Douglas. If you don't know who that is, well, you should check out the interview so you can learn more. If you do know who that is, you should check out the interview so you can learn more. That will be on the next episode, the next interview episode of the podcast. So looking forward to talking with Lori this coming weekend about her book. If you're a fan of this podcast, as always, please do me the favor of writing a review or leaving a starred review, whichever works easiest, or, whichever you can do. Either way definitely helps us to get the podcast out to more people. If you're not already following the podcast on social media, why not? Come on. It'll be fun. I don't know if it'll be fun, but no, it'll be fun. I got to be positive. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. So wherever you like to hang out on social media, you can find us. And so come say hi. Tell me what you're reading. Tell me what is going on in your world these days. I love to hear from listeners. Hope your week is going well. It's Tuesday. It's December. Things are probably busy. I don't know. Maybe they're not. Maybe they are. Maybe they aren't. But I hope that no matter what is going on in your life, if you are in the midst of
any kind of holiday prep, whatever holiday that might be. I hope that you are finding time for yourself and finding balance between the craziness that this time of year can bring and, the downtime and the time with family that helps to. It really is the whole point of the season and the holidays: family, love, being together, etc. But what I really hope for you is that no matter what is going on, no matter how crazy your life is, no matter how much holiday decorating or preparation you have to do, that you still take some time, sit down, get yourself the beverage of your choice, and find plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book. Have a great week.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.